All right, our next part of Roman art, we're going to focus on sculpture. And in class, we already reviewed kind of the three different categories of a Roman sculpture, the Republican, early imperial, and late imperial. One distinction I did want to make in this screencast, though, is oftentimes you will see the imperial just kind of blended. So quite often you will hear, Republican style or imperial. I went ahead and redefined early and late imperial for you so that you could see that there is, towards the end of the imperial period, there is a transition, kind of back to generic style sculpture. But ultimately, don't be confused if you just hear these two combined and sculpture just being referenced as imperial style sculpture, okay? We went through and categorized these correctly in class. We said that this was the first example of the late imperial, then we have an example of Republican, and then we have an example of early imperial. So now we're going to talk about the actual sculptures and the actual images themselves. So this is image number 42. The title is Head of a Roman Patrician. It is from the Roman Republic, 75 to 50 BCE. We are looking at carved marble. And what we see here is a lot of realism, and we talked about it being almost hyper realistic, that a lot of the features are exaggerated, that the person that was being displayed here is probably not as kind of old in age as they appear to be in the sculpture, but that it is, something that is symbolic of kind of the traits of wisdom and knowledge. That type of a portrait is called a veristic portrait. And basically, like I said, that refers to a hyper realistic portrayal of the subject's facial characteristics. So, veristic images will show male subjects with receding hairlines, extremely deep wrinkles like age warts and age spots and blemishes and things like that that may not actually be factual to the person that's being portrayed. But if you think of them as, a sculpture that's aging them, advancing them a few years in age. Um, but the other thing I really wanted to make sure that you compared it to, this kind of, Republic style, is very similar to the Greek Hellenistic period. Remember that Greek Hellenistic period was about finally dealing with common people and emotions, and taking sculpture away from only being about the divine and turning it into more like, human subject matters with human emotions, not always about, victory, but sometimes about, emotions of sadness or loss, defeat. And even though the Republic sculptures are not necessarily about human emotions per se, but they are about kind of your average human. They are not divine sculptures, first and foremost. And secondly, they are meant to kind of pay homage to that, standard civilian and their kind of importance in society and in, civil leadership. So there's a lot of, I think, similarities between the Roman Republic and Greek Hellenistic art. There's not much to say about this except, understanding the veristic portrait, understanding that we are looking at a male subject that played an important part in government, and that, what these symbols of wrinkles and deep flesh crevices represent. Okay. Um, We definitely have Rome Republic sculptures that are primarily of men. They are mostly of men because really it was, your white privileged male that was able to participate in forms of government, and that's really, all that was allowed. And so that's pretty much what you're going to see for your Roman Republic busts, especially. Our next image that we've already looked at is image number 43 in our book, and we really kind of critiqued him in class together and tried to use some of our observation skills to notice important details about him. Well, now the title of this sculpture is Augustus of Prima Porta. It's from 20 CE. Okay. Notice we've made that leap, and we are again looking at marble. And we have an imperial style specifically. So remember, we're using imperial style as a generic term, but specifically this would be early imperial style. And what we have here is an idealized view of a Roman emperor. Okay. Now we know that this is Augustus because there are a couple of things that symbolize what we know about Augustus, and specifically it's the hair. So the hairline and the fact that he has a lock of hair that kind of falls over the right eye. I know it's hard to see in this image, but if you could blow it up and look closely, there's kind of like a curl or locks of hair, and that was definitely a symbol of Augustus. Even though this isn't like an exact sculpting of Augustus and what he looked like, what it is an iconic view of Augustus. So it's slightly more generic, and there's subtle symbols in there that tell us who specifically this person is. But generally speaking, it's supposed to represent a great Roman emperor. Okay. So what we're looking at here in this imperial style is kind of a visit back to that classical Greece. You're going to have that beautiful contrapposto stance. We have the drapery, of the folds of the fabric. That drapery actually represents a robe, and it's specifically a judge's robe, and that is supposed to symbolize kind of that is a civic ruler, not just an emperor, but a civic ruler. Also, in regards to his clothing, we talked about the breastplate. The breastplate itself is a symbol that we're also looking at a warrior. So we're looking at, a leader of an army who was very successful. And we have a lot of merging of kind of roles within this one sculpture. Again, an emperor, a civic leader, and then a leader of the army, a warrior per se. So a lot of the different hats that Augustus was known for wearing kind of all wrapped up symbolically into one sculpture. If you look closely at the breastplate, again, you'll have to blow that up, but we have images of gods participating in some of the Roman standards from the Parthians. So we have remember, we have the Pantheon, the Roman Pantheon was similar to Greece, but kind of translated to be their own. And what we're looking at on this breastplate is some of those Roman gods that are kind of participating in what is considered Roman morals and Roman standards. So if you're able to blow that up and look closely, that is what you'll see on the breastplate carvings. We also have some other great symbols in here. For one, when we talk about a leader, an emperor, what we have alongside of his contrapposto pose is we have this lifting of the arm and that subtle pointing of the finger. It's almost like a relaxed gesture, relaxed, pointing of the finger. And that is specifically called the oracle pose. The oracle pose was definitely, or I'm sorry, the orator pose. The orator pose was definitely used as a symbol of a leader. And there's a lot of theories that within his hands, maybe there are some things that are missing. So, for example, in his left arm here at his side, a lot of art historians believe that there was probably a metal sword that he kind of held downward in front of him. That typically was a symbol to show a person, as a successful warrior, but also when the sword was down, it kind of shows that they're, represents that they're in a time of peace. And then some art historians believe that maybe in the right hand, alongside his orator pose, that maybe a laurel wreath kind of was sandwiched between his fingers or something, and that laurel wreath also represents, kind of being a leader, a civic ruler. So there's some symbols that we believed were there at one time, but we also have on this pedestal and down below, kind of tugging on his robe, we see a small figure, and it's hard to tell from this angle, but this figure, who is Cupid, by the way, is sitting on top of a dolphin. That's what is behind him and under him. Those symbols are supposed to represent the goddess Venus, and it's supposed to symbolize that Augustus maybe is a descent from Venus. So what we're looking at, again, going back to that classical Greece, is we're looking at a leader, a person in history that has been designed more as an icon for an emperor, but not just an emperor, a divine emperor. So back to that thought of that, our leaders were very godlike, whether that be, kind of like the Egyptians believed that they were actual, descents, bloodlines of gods, or if it's more of a symbolic understanding that our leaders, are kind of at that same importance and elevation as our gods. So that's really what this sculpture, has a lot packed into it in terms of symbolism. It's not as simplistic as it looks. When you really pick it apart, there's a lot of things to understand about it. Now, this is one we haven't mentioned yet, we haven't talked to you about yet, and it's one of my favorites, and actually one of my favorite vocabulary words for College Board in this entire year is going to be introduced with this art piece. So this is number 47 in your book. It's called Ludovisi Battle, and what it is a sarcophagus. It's from 250 to 260 CE. It's made from marble. Now, we've heard the term sarcophagus before from the Etruscans, and we know that it is, a funerary object made to hold the remains of the deceased. The remains, could sometimes be the ashes, but the remains could also just be, the bones and things like that. So this image down here kind of shows you the sarcophagus itself. It's very rectangular, but it is kind of on two pedestal feet, okay? But what AP gives you in terms of images is just kind of a close-up of the carvings, and that's what we're going to focus on. So the term that I want you to become familiar with, this object, and we will revisit this term in other images, this is called a composition that is horror vacui. And again, I just love that vocabulary term. But what that means is that the surface, the composition and the surface is so crowded that there's literally no negative space left, that the positive space has devoured every ounce of the composition to the point where there's literally no negative space left. There's no untouched surface. And when you have something like that, that's called Hor vacui. So that is what we're looking at here. It's such a crowded surface of figures with so much overlapping and piling on top of each other that there's literally no negative space left. Okay? Now the figures, they definitely lack individuality. So here we go again. We're talking about that imperial sculpture where they're more iconic. They're more symbolic and representative of people. And what we're looking at in this one specifically are the Romans versus like the barbarians. The barbarians are the Goths, and we have kind of this common generic look for each group of people. So if you look at your Romans, okay, it's like you can totally point them out in this Hor vacui composition. The Romans look very young. They're very clean faced, smooth skin, kind of very similar facial features. They all kind of have, clean shaven faces. Those are your Romans. And then when you look closely at your barbarians, all of your barbarians are extremely shaggy. They all have big beards and mustaches and long hair, and everything, on their face is full of texture. If you get up close, their facial features are, very broad and very wide with like very fluffy, curly eyebrows. So it's like they've definitely kind of mainstreamed the look of what the Roman would look like and what the barbarian would look like. Okay? What's so great about this composition of Hor vacui is it really echoes just the entire concept of battle. And, when you think about charging into battle and the two opposing forces, coming together for that first time, like it is extreme chaos. And exactly what we see here, where you see layers and layers of people on top of people, and everybody's tangled up and wrapped around each other, and you have horses that are kicking and horses that are falling and laying on the ground. I mean, just everything is somersaulting around. And so the composition and the carving really complements just the actual idea and concept of battle. So if you also look at the composition, okay, and if you look at it as a top to bottom, knowing that we've kind of generalized the features of the Romans versus the features of the barbarians, if you look closely, what people are on the top opposed to what are the people on the bottom? And so we can definitely see that the bottom of the composition is really filled with mostly barbarians. Barbarians that are on the ground or knelt down before them, and that really the ones that are still standing, the ones that prevail, are definitely the Romans themselves. Okay. In the center of, well, the top center of this composition, we have a very youthful Roman, and he's different than all of the others because we kind of have all of the others are engaged in some sort of action or interaction with somebody else. And then here in this top center, you have a young Roman with arms kind of stretched out and not really, interacting with anybody else or in, a one-on-one battle himself. And so we also have him mounted on a horse, but actually there's no weapons. If you look at all the others, you can see shields and swords and many types of weapons that are in hand or being used. This person is weapon free. We also are looking at him with absolutely no helmet at all, no protective gear. Aside from the barbarians, the Romans, all have their kind of protective gear on as well. And so what we're looking at here is this is definitely the leader, the general, the military leader. But there's such confidence in this general that doesn't need weapons. He doesn't need a helmet. It's almost indicative that he's completely invincible and there is no need for protection, that the Romans will prevail, and that the Goths and the barbarians, they will for sure be defeated. Okay? This is kind of indicative also of Roman culture because really Rome participated in a lot of warfare, a lot of very strategic war. They were very successful at war and at battle. So it was actually something that they were quite proud of. They were able to grow their empire largely and rapidly. And so at the time that the sarcophagus was created, we're looking at, Rome is at war pretty much throughout that 3rd century. So this was pretty common for them. So again, this is a depiction of the good guys versus the bad guys. Like I said, the Romans were the good guys and the enemies were the Goths. And the Romans featured are, extremely idea, pure, young, clean, and the Goths are just scraggly, worn, and unkempt. Okay, so again, representing instead of specifically and individually depicting. These are just a few more close-ups and getting into the actual carving and form itself. What we have here is a high relief carving. So we've talked a lot about carvings, and I'd say for the majority of our carvings, we talked about low relief, which is called bas relief. So in Mesopotamia and Egypt, we talked a lot about those bas relief carvings. Now what we're looking at is the opposite. This is a high relief. It's high relief because of exactly what you think. The carvings are so deep, but the reason why it's called a relief, okay, is because it is still attached to a slab. So it's not freestanding, and that's the difference. You call something, a relief carving because it's still, kind of is attached to that slab and it's been carved into. Whether it's shallow carving or an extremely deep carving like this one, that's how you distinguish between high and low or bas relief and high relief. Okay. If you look closely in some of these areas, it's really amazing to me because you have 2 to 4 layers of figures and forms. So if we kind of just take a close look here, we have in the foreground the arm of this figure, and then beneath him we have the horse, and then behind that you have the figure of a barbarian. Behind the torso of the barbarian, you have his left arm and his shield. And then behind that, you have another figure behind that. I mean, it's absolutely amazing the amount of depth and layers that this was carved. It was just extremely skillful and definitely needs to be notable when talking about this piece. It's also extremely dynamic, probably one of the most dynamic pieces we've looked at thus far. There's nothing static. Every single figure is in endless movement. And then if you think about, the elements and principles of movement and rhythm that we have endless movement from one figure to another. That if I were to, come to this middle picture and look at this barbarian and follow his figure all the way through, then I'm absolutely picked up by the next figure, and I start following the next figure, and then I'm picked up by the next figure. So it's almost like it's just this continuous line that my eye travels equally throughout the entire sarcophagus. So it's just absolutely endless movement. Um, we talked about the use of texture. Texture here is, not only indicative of the beauty of this skillful carving, and you look at all the drapery and all of that, but the texture is also symbolic, okay? It's used as a way to represent and distinguish the Romans from the Goths, okay? You have the beautiful qualities of the chaotic surface. We know the function is meant to hold ashes and remains of the dead. We do not have identification of the person that this sarcophagus was constructed for. We're not sure of who that person was, but we know for sure that whoever that person was, they were extremely important, extremely wealthy, that this was a very high caliber sarcophagus, that it was extremely lavish, and a lot of money was spent on having it constructed for the deceased. Okay, moving on to our next sculpture. The sculpture is actually kind of a, a replica of a column. At least it takes a column shape. It's not a column like we know it. It's not necessarily an architectural feature on some sort of structure. It's a freestanding column, but it's called the Column of Trajan. And I've given you multiple images here because I felt like this was an image that was kind of hard to understand. So in this picture, this is the Column of Trajan. So we're looking at a complex that we will revisit in the architectural part of our Roman unit. But within the complex, there is this freestanding column, and that's just what we're going to focus on right now. But again, it's kind of hard to distinguish because this complex, really what it is it's it's a state of ruins, and so it's hard to kind of understand what was what. So right here, this tall column is the Column of Trajan. This is a semi close-up of it, so you can see that all the way up this form, this column form, are these registers, okay, with some carvings that go all the way around it from the bottom of the column pretty much to the top. And then at the very top of the column, you can kind of see like there's some sort of ornament up there. Well, this is it, okay? This is a sculpture of Trajan, and that's what's on top. Now, I wanted also to give you some close-up images of the carvings, and these are, in my opinion, they're a little bit more, they're like a combination of bas relief and, let's just say, relief. Maybe not so high relief, but if you look at the background, you can definitely see those bas relief qualities, right? Where things are just kind of slightly carved in. But then the figures and some other features pop out a little bit more to show some dimension. So we have a really lovely combination of relief carving and bas relief carving. There's so much carving on this column, it's impossible to become familiar with all of it, and really College Board doesn't need us to. But out of curiosity, I've put here a really wonderful link to a website that takes you through Trajan's column kind of scene by scene. If you're just interested in learning like what the scenes represent, this tells an entire story of Trajan. And if you're interested in learning more, this would be the link for you. Okay, so now getting into the information about the column of Trajan, it is image 45 in your book. It's from 112 CE. It is marble and it stands 128 feet tall and it's located in Rome. So what we're looking at here, what the function of this column is it's a burial chamber. And it is the burial chamber of Trajan himself, whose ashes were placed there at the bottom base down here, okay? It is located amid Trajan's Forum, and this is the complex, like the architectural civic complex that we will be talking about when we get into our architectural portion, okay? But it's located within that complex. So what we're looking at around the column is a narrative, and it's a narrative that is wrapped around the column. So I'm not sure if you can tell from this picture, but you can kind of see the lines that spiral around the column, you know, from the bottom to the top of the Capitol. And those are the registers that we're looking at, and all those kind of bas relief carvings are located within those registers. And if you were to unwind those registers and kind of stretch them out, we would be looking at a narrative that was at least 625 feet long. So it's extremely long, intensive narrative. Basically, it tells the story of Trajan's defeat of the Dacians. And so again, you don't need to know, you know, specific information to all of the, you know, details of the narrative. But if you feel curious and interested, then please check out that link, especially if you are, you know, really someone that's into history and into kind of ancient Roman civilization. It might be of quite a bit of interest to you. But overall, you do need to know that the narrative tells the story of Trajan's defeat of the Dacians, okay? It's 150 episodes, and so that's what I mean by scenes, okay? 150 scenes within a continuous narrative. And there's over 2,500 figures, and then there's 23 registers. So the registers are these spaces. So if I were to count upward, right, you know, from line to line, that would be 23 registers. And then within the registers, there's scenes, but they're also called episodes, okay? It's a very crowded composition. If we go back and take a peek, you know, we're definitely looking at a very crowded composition. It's busy. Even when we have negative space behind the figures, it's still kind of treated, you know, architecturally. There's not just a lot of empty space around the figures. It's always, you know, treated with something. So it's a very crowded composition. I wouldn't go so far as call it horror vacui though, okay? Because there is evidence of negative space. We're not looking at, you know, layers upon layers upon layers. It's crowded, but it's not horror vacui, okay? Like I said before, we're looking primarily at bas relief carving. There's been a lot of debate on how you are meant to view or read the narrative for the column. And the reason is because, remember, this was part of an entire complex. And so when we're left with the ruins of the complex, but when we think about how the complex looked in its original form, a lot of these buildings interacted with each other. And so on that note, what we understand is that the column itself meant to be entered, okay? So this down here and the actual tomb part of it, this was a doorway, okay? So you were meant to enter the door, and then up inside the column, a lot kind of like the Statue of Liberty, there's a spiral stairs, okay? So you climb up the stairs, and then out here, again, I know it's hard to tell, but this is actually like a railing up here. Excuse me. And this is like a lookout tower. So this is a place for you to view the complex from the platform. And this sculpture up here is actually not the original sculpture. Okay, so let's go back a second. This right here is currently the sculpture that's up there, but originally it was not. Originally it was a statue, like a heroic nude statue, just kind of like not an individual. It was just, you know, like a imperial heroic nude statue, like something you would see from classical Greece. But then it was later replaced with the Emperor Trajan himself, okay? And so this was a platform for you to better view that sculpture, okay? So the question is, at what point, though, are you supposed to view these registers? You know, if you enter from the bottom and then you come out at the top on this platform, how in the world are you supposed to observe and view all of these registers in the narrative of the column? So looking back at the complex and how the buildings interact with each other, on each side of the libraries, or on each side of the column, were two Roman libraries. And those libraries contained Greek and Roman manuscripts, but they flanked the column. And so they thought that the column could be viewed from maybe the roof or the top of the libraries. And that's how you would actually appreciate the narrative of the column itself. Otherwise, if you think about it, you wouldn't even be able to see all of this bas relief carving otherwise. So when we return and we review our sculpture portion, I want you to be able to try to tell me this Trajan column. When we look closely at the bas relief carvings, what do you think, how would you classify Trajan's column? Do you think that this sculpture column would be more Republic or Imperial? And then be prepared to kind of defend your answer. How do you know, and what are the characteristics that tell you?